We are not masters of nature. Nature will master us if we don't live with it. It's our limited human concept expressed in 3 letters of the alphabet, pinning a name to the infinite. But beyond that, I think what that's saying, well, it's my interpretation, is God is just a word. One brings the text of one's own life to the text of Scripture. The search for the new might lead one to think, well, it's boring to hear the same stories year in, year out, but actually they grow on one. Every year one perceives different things. And I was recalling a scene from a hospice. There was a request, would a chaplain please come and pray with them because the young man was very near to death. And then he turned to me and he said, just very simply, and now say a prayer for the end of life because it's over. And he said, I want you to know that, I found God in Auschwitz, not the God of my childhood, the omnipotent God who controls everything, but that God was there, but disfigured and blasphemed.
Hello, welcome back to another edition of Re-Enchanting. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And we bring you fascinating conversations with fascinating individuals week to week, where we aim to re-enchant an arguably disenchanted materialistic culture with the wonder and the awe of what we find in the story of Scripture. And that's very relevant to today, isn't it, Belle?
Very relevant, because the book we're going to be speaking about today is one of the most enchanting books I've read in a long time. And we are honoured, really, to be joined by Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg. Hello.
Thank you for having me. It's my honour and a pleasure. Thank you kindly.
Oh, it's a joy. So if I introduce you to anyone who's not aware of you yet, you are Rabbi of New North London Synagogue and Senior Rabbi of Masorti Judaism here in the UK. He's also the author of numerous books, as we've said, including Walking with the Light from Frankfurt to Finchley, and Things My Dog Has Taught Me About Being a Better Human, which I think is the best title of a book I've ever come across, and his latest, which we'll be talking about today, Listening for God in Torah and Creation.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Rabbi Jonathan. We always kick things off the same way, though, here on this programme, because we record this here on the top floor of Lambeth Palace Library. And that is simply the question, what have you been reading lately?
So I love reading about nature. So I've been reading Robert Macfarlane's books about wild places and his search for them. And then he's taken me to Roger Deakin's book on woodlands. And so that's one strand of what I've been reading. But I've also been, in terms of today's debate, I've also been beginning to read around different views on assisted dying.
Okay. Well, that gives you the clue that we're recording this on the day that the assisted dying bill is being debated, though we don't know what the outcome of that is, and but our listeners will by the time they hear this. But and that's a great example of the way in which your work intersects with so many questions in public culture and everything else. Do you tend to find yourself reading sort of for pleasure or for kind of in your kind of professional role most of the time?
It crosses over. So I try to read for pleasure late at night, but there's always things which I need to read for professional life. Yeah. And there's always things that I ought to have read and haven't read. And that is the biggest list of it all. Yes. And actually just at the moment, I'm also reading other things, which is with my second mother died aged 100 a year ago. And going through the house, we have family papers from the beginning of the 19th century and the lives of my great-grandparents and grandparents. So I'm actually reading some of that material insofar as I can decipher it.
Yes. Gosh.
Amazing. Wow. I was wondering if I could ask you a little of your story in that, and do forgive my ignorance, I have no idea how one becomes a rabbi. So I was just wondering how you got to where you are today and what influences brought you there and what people brought you there and all of those good things.
So I sometimes ask myself the same question, how did I end up here? So I should say that it's in my family on both sides.
Okay.
Both sides of my family were refugees from Nazi Germany. And both my parents were lucky to come with their immediate family.
Yeah.
So my mother's father was a rabbi in Frankfurt am Main. He knew from very early on that this is what he wanted to do because his father was a rabbi. Then it missed a generation, but I was very close to my grandfather. And I was 18 when he died, so I had a lot of time with him. I knew them less, but actually my father's side, his grandfather, and a whole line of rabbis before that were really very well-known figures in Orthodox Jewry in Germany, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Wow. So I think this caught up with me at some point. It was certainly not obvious to me, and I was, for a long time, unclear what I wanted to do. Studied English, then education, then did some teaching. Then I began to work for the community where I'm still at, and they encouraged me. And a little bit reluctantly, would I be up to this? Did I have the faith for it? What would it mean? And then you find yourself in it, and then you don't look back. And to be honest, my community inspires me. There are people who, some formally more religious, some less, but they live lives, they do things, they care for people in ways that I find deeply moving and feel very connected to them and appreciate listening to them. So that inspires me, as well as the huge history of Jewish culture and Jewish literature and the world of nature.
Yeah. Hearing that you studied English makes a lot of sense, actually, reading your book, because there are some wonderful references and quotes to poets and Leonard Cohen, all of the greats. You say in your, and I really can't emphasize this enough, truly beautiful book, there's this phrase that you use, the companionship of Torah. And I was just wondering, what does it as a companion mean, both like theologically, but also in your own life as part of that story?
So just practically, in Jewish ritual, one reads a portion of the Torah every week on the Sabbath morning.
And just for those who may not even quite know what the Torah encompasses, would you just define
The Torah
that?
encompasses the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis through to Deuteronomy. We also call it in Hebrew the Chumash, the 5. And it has the status of the most sacred text in Judaism. And we read it in an annual cycle, so that this becomes, if one's a regular synagogue goer, deeply familiar over the course of one's life. And whereas the kind of the search for the new might lead one to think, well, it's boring to hear the same stories year in, year out, but actually they grow on one. Every year one perceives different things within them, because one brings the text of one's own life to the text of Scripture. And
it reminds me of that quote by G.K. Chesterton, who's something along the lines of, it's only adults who get bored by repetition. Children want to hear the same story over and over again, and it brings them delight over and over again. And there's something about that, isn't there?
Absolutely. Somebody said, just try telling them the story of the 6 dwarves and they'll soon put you right. There really is. And also there's the written Torah, which we read from parchment on a scroll on the Sabbath. But then there's this huge riches, because Judaism is a literature of interpretation. So what you might have is a relatively contemporary commentator quoting a medieval commentator who quotes an early rabbinic kind of vignette, which is looking at a gap in the text and trying, what happened here? What was happening between Cain and Abel that all of a sudden we're told that Cain rose up against Abel and smote him? What was their debate about? And then you take that through into, in a way, the challenge of each generation is to take that tradition and bring it into the now of one's community.
This is something that I found reading through your book, is I was reminded again that many people from my tradition, a kind of evangelical sort of Christian tradition, sort of see the Bible sort of as fixed and as canon, and you sort of, that's what you're dealing with. Whereas there's a much more sort of fluid sort of relationship with the scriptures, and a lot of this commentary that is also seen as very important and valid alongside, obviously, the core texts in the Jewish tradition.
There's a rather facetious Jewish saying, God, thank you for giving us your Torah. we'll now tell you how we read it. But there is a huge plasticity within Jewish tradition. Yes. I mean, once Jewish law has been formulated, that's much less subject to change, and there are rules of how you go about that. But in terms of interpretation, there's a freedom of imagination. So the world of midrash, and the word midrash comes from the root darash, which means to search. It's a searching of the text for its nuance, for its gaps, for its inconsistencies. Where can I fill in something where we're not quite told what it was that happened? And so there's this potential for imagination. And in the end, you find yourself reading it through the eyes of many different people. And again, in Jewish mystical literature, there is, you can almost read the words in a different order. It's very playful, but behind it is a sense that this is not just the way we construe the words according to grammar and sentence structure. This is black fire on white fire. Yeah. And that potential is latent within the text. Classic rabbinic comment, there are 70 faces to Torah.
Wow.
And what does that so I did biblical studies, and when you do biblical studies, and the type that I did, is you're really looking at the text as something that was created by a human. And so, like you say, it has gaps and it has quirks and it has contradictions and it has all of these things. And then being a Christian, which, as Justin has said, uses a lot less of the imagination in the way that Jewish scholars do. I found that some conversations I had with Christians, that was quite threatening, to really dig into the authorship and what might that person be doing, and that's a quirky word to use there, and to really hone in on the human author was to somehow undermine God's part in it all. But that doesn't seem to be an issue in Jewish scholarship. Is that right?
It really indeed is an issue, and you've outlined it very, very well.
Okay. Go on.
So the classic view of Torah was this was dictated by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. When exactly Moses wrote it down during the course of the 40 years in the wilderness, that's open to some debate, and a question about the last 11 verses when Moses is up the mountain and dies there. So who wrote it?
Sure.
But it's divine authorship.
Right.
Over the course of biblical study from Wellhausen onwards, and it was a Christian discipline, but has implications for Jewish scholarship as well, the sense that the authorship is entirely divine is challenged in various ways by historical evidence, archaeological evidence, legal parallels in ancient civilizations, and above all by the text itself, which contains different linguistic strata, uses in places different emphasize different names for God, repeats stories. And my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs, whom I reference a lot in the introduction, came from the Orthodox world and said, but we can maintain our Jewish Orthodox observance, but we have to acknowledge empirical truth from wherever it comes. And empirical truth suggests that we can't think of this as a book dictated by God, but rather as human beings reaching up to God and the divine reaching down to us, and then meeting, but the language is human. And that caused an enormous public row, which reached the headlines in the national papers in the 60s. Wow. And I grew up with this tradition, and I talk about the importance of contextualizing scripture in the introduction. For example, what the Torah and other scriptures, but also in the New Testament, have to say about the role of women vis-a-vis men, or the attitude you find there to homosexuality, or indeed the laws of war, that the danger of taking them as if they had no historical context was, well, why aren't we applying that now? Sure. So contextualization is hugely important, because we also have dangerous texts in scripture. On the other hand, in the introduction, I've also wanted to say, but there's this mystical tradition, and we have to let go, we have to take off our critical glasses. We have to know when to put them on and when to take them off, but we've got them all the time. We are, as it were, outside the text looking at it. And we also need the text to master us.
Yes. I mean, and what you're describing there are lots of parallels, obviously, with Christian theology and the sort of some of the struggles people have had to understand, reconcile, and interpret Scripture over the centuries, really. But what led you specifically to want to write this book? What's the story behind listening for God in Torah and Creation?
So I guess I've spent my life reading and studying and listening to other people's understandings of these stories, my community understanding, trying to articulate them week by week. And I think as a challenge, I wanted to put some of that in writing. Speaking and writing are very different disciplines.
Yeah.
So I began, wasn't sure where this was going, and then came lockdown. And working on this became a life-saving mental health early morning discipline, which kept me going. Yes. I mean, I would say I probably spent 4 to 5 years on it, so it wasn't all lockdown, but that was a key phase with it. Yeah.
And you say this in the book. You say that you haven't written it solely for Jewish people, and as soon as you read the book, you understand why. It's very obvious why, and you're so inclusive in the way you write, in that if you have absolutely no understanding of Jewish tradition, Jewish beliefs, Jewish practice, Jewish scholarship, it doesn't matter. You lead us by the hand anyway. But why was it important to you? Because you made this job really hard for yourself, I think, in doing that. Why was it important for you that this book like bursts the banks of your own faith tradition and can speak to people who don't share it?
So there's several reasons for that, and thank you for raising that question. It was very important to me from the start for different reasons. One of them is that having some experience of listening to Christian scholars talk about the Bible, I had the sense that the text of the Bible was very, very familiar, and perhaps critical method as well, but how Jews read the Bible wasn't. And that whole centuries and centuries of exegesis, and how it led to sort of very different kind of sense of the sacred word. And I wanted to make that available, because I think it leads into a deeper understanding between Jews and Christians. And the other thing is, I've never thought of a phrase like the Jewish God has never made sense to me. There's the oneness that encompasses us all. And when I've been in churches, sometimes at a service, sometimes just, I've always loved small country churches. You feel this awe, this atmosphere of prayer, this presence of God. And thinking about faith from a different angle, it can be very helpful. I've more or less never felt threatened by it. I felt this opens doors to a greater depth and width, and you come to understand what is secondary and what is absolutely essential in one's own faith. So that was another reason why it was important to me.
Yeah. You touch on so much in it, but one theme that's really prevalent, whether you reference it by name or not, is this, and you've very briefly touched on it, this theme of awe and wonder is so prevalent in this book. And I've been doing a lot of reading and writing on the emotions of awe and wonder at the moment, because they seem to be, I don't know if you've noticed this, but they seem to be having a real resurgence in study. And there's Dr. Daka Keltner, I think his name is, he's really driving this study, because awe and wonder are two human emotions that have been seriously overlooked, seriously underestimated, and seriously understudied, and it's because they're so elusive to pin down. But basically his whole point is that they're really good for us and we're starving ourselves of them. So like I say, your book is laced with them, laced with awe and laced with wonder, just the way you write, but also the things you write about. And so I was just wondering, on that topic in particular, what is awe and wonder to you? how does it play out in your reading of Torah, but also in creation, I guess, because that's the other thing that God speaks through. And why is it beneficial for our souls?
Well, I'm looking forward very much to reading what you're going to be writing and some of the things that have led you on that path as well. And I very much agree. I think that the whole title of the series, Re-Enchantment, we've sort of reduced the world in a constant sort of materialist grind down and lost a great deal that nourishes our spirit and our souls. And we also are aware with the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis of the need to re-engage with the wonder of the natural world. And I particularly associate wonder with nature. And when the children were small, and I suppose this relates also to my own sense of wonder, and we used to go a lot to the New Forest. We still do. It's a part of the wildest part of Britain that's near. And if they wouldn't sleep at night, I would take them, they were quite small, to the car. I would drive into the middle of the forest, into a parking place, switch the engine off, switch the lights off, open the windows, it would be midnight, and say, listen. And they would for a while, and something would scare them. Sure. But I was how does one convey and educate for a sense of wonder? And I was trying to answer that question. I think they've all got it in the world of nature, actually. We're all lovers of it. So that experience speaks to me, and sometimes life is so hectic, it's hard to nourish oneself enough. And then I feel the impoverishment of the spirit when I don't. And I'll add to that something textual, which is the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, 12th century, died in 1204, I think. He writes early in his compendium on the laws of the foundations of Torah. And he says, really, what is the love of God? He's talking about wonder. It's when you go out and you see how majestic and how magnificent the world is, and you say to yourself, look at this creation. And awe, the fear of God, but I think fear here really means awe, is when you take the step back and say, who am I, this small creature, to experience this magnificence?
It's a bit, is it Psalm 8 where...
It's Psalm 8, he quotes Psalm 8.
Yeah,
he quotes Psalm 8, yeah.
When I look at the works of your hands, the heavens you've created,
what is man?
What is man that you are mindful of him?
Absolutely.
It's sort of that, and you do get that sense, don't you, that although obviously that was written in a pre-scientific age when, the author had no concept, arguably, of just how vast the universe is, nonetheless, they probably experience it in ways that we often fail to today, the kind of awe and wonder, because we sadly live in a culture where light pollution, for instance, has often masks the real beauty of the night sky. Technology sometimes works against us, sometimes almost, in really engaging with awe and wonder, because we're more focused on our smartphones than looking up at the heavens. Whereas I wonder whether in more ancient times, if you like, there was less of a sort of barrier in that sense of just being within the awesomeness of nature. That way.
I would agree with what you said entirely. And this is this series called Re-Enchantment, but there's also reconnection. And I think urbanization and the pace of our lives and the degree of technology have alienated and separated us from a world of nature, which is part of our soul language and need to be reconnected with. So a lot of people will talk about trees, rivers, animals, birdsong as part of their essential spiritual life, and listening and being among them as a form of meditation or prayer. And my heart goes out to that. It speaks to me.
There's this Theos think tank. They've just released a report and a animated short video just simply called In Sync with the Sun. And it's all about how we chose productivity. When we stopped living our lives, our literal days in sync with the sun, stopping when the sun sets, starting when it rises, living with the rhythms of the year, the rhythms of the season. And instead we started putting this technology in place. It's like saying, it's just always worth remembering, isn't it, that saying yes to something is saying no to something else. So saying yes to productivity at all costs was saying no to connection to the rhythms of the world.
Yeah, and there's also something, and here I think both our traditions have been blamed for this, of anthropocentrism, and the superiority of the human being in conquest of nature, and using knowledge not to deepen our sense of wonder and awe, but to control. Knowledge is power, would be a classic example of that, and relinquishing some of that to rediscover the sense of mystery. And it's, take for example David Attenborough's programs, or something my wife and I are addicted to late at night, This Farming Life, following farmers in Scotland. A rediscovery of our interconnectedness, actually our codependence, and a certain modesty of retreat. We are not masters of nature. Nature will master us if we don't live with it.
It's funny because just before we started recording, we were taping up curtains to ensure the sun doesn't sort of blind you, as our guest, because we're recording on a very bright day here at the top of Lambeth Palace Library with these huge plate glass windows that let the sun in and stream in. And I said, we're just going to pin this curtain up so it doesn't blind you. And you said, yes, because there's not much you can do about the sun moving across the sky. It's kind of, we have to work with the sun. But yet we do try to sort of, as you say, conquer nature and sort of do things that essentially try to tame or allow us to, in some way, subdue it in the wrong way. Because we obviously, you talk about the start of the book, the fact that they're in the Genesis account, humans are given this special role, to put in charge, if you like, to steward God's creation. Some of the translations are about subduing it. But what for you is that supposed to be when it comes to the way it's related to us in the Torah?
So that verse is indeed understood in the way that you have said, and has been taken as the Judeo-Christian attitude to nature. Subdue it, you can use it, it's yours, at your disposal, humanity. But most Jewish environmentalists will begin with the second chapter of Genesis, in which God says, God took Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden, where the Garden of Eden represents the world. And the classic translation of the two Hebrew words that follow, le'ovda, to work it, or l'shomra, but also to keep it. That stewardship, that trust. But there's also, and I'm trying to think of the scholar's name, she's at Duke, and in her book Culture, Scripture, Culture and Agriculture, she talks about the deeper meaning of these words, that the word translated as work also means to serve, particularly to serve God. So there's a sense of deep respect and reverence for the earth implied in that. And the word for to keep also means to keep God's commandments. So it's more than just look after it. It's understand that this is a sacred trust and we do not have the right to destroy it. So that becomes then the core of understanding the Hebrew Bible, which is, over its hundreds of years, it's produced by communities that are subsistence agriculture communities. Here are people, including the prophets, including the monarchs, who know that we're dependent on the land. The understanding that God rewards us with rainfall, God punishes us with drought. The quotation from Ecclesiastes, even the king is dependent or subservient to the soil. It's a very chastening comment. And they know the names of the birds and the plants and how to care for the animals that they tend. There's even a section of the Mishnah, so 2nd century, a rabbinic work, that discusses your animals are supposed to rest on the Sabbath. So what can they wear? A donkey is cold, they say. It always feels cold. I can't judge this one for myself. So it can wear a blanket, but you can't put anything on it that looks like it's work gear, because it's obliged to rest. So this fine understanding and attunement is really, 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 really special.
Yeah. How does God speak through the natural world, in that there's this little line of a poem which is kind of going viral on social media at the moment, and it's so simple, and it just says, God spoke today through flowers, and I, who was waiting on words, nearly missed the conversation. And I've seen Christians share that. I've seen people who aren't Christians share that. It seems to, just transcend, like, just there's something within us that resonates with that. But I was just wondering, in your experience, but also in your expertise, how do we learn about God through the natural world? How does he speak to us?
So if it's a wonderful line. It's great that it's going viral. The more viral, the better. So actually, one thing which you can carefully consider together with Andy Lyon, a wonderful editor, was it's listening for God, not listening to God. Because it's the endeavor to try and hear or overhear.
Right.
And I think that's one of the experiences. I'm at the moment trying to write something about different kinds of listening. And one of the themes is listening in the world of nature. And one can be overtaken by the sense of wonder, as if one is party to a depth of life and articulation which is not human speech. Bird song's an obvious example.
Yes.
The trees at night, one feels one's in the presence of a kind of meditation. And there's to take that back to the Bible, there's this beautiful verse, at least I love this verse, when the tabernacle in the wilderness is finally dedicated. There's this huge ceremony of princes bringing gifts and so on. And then in one line we're told, when Moses went into the tent of meeting and heard the voice speaking to him, but the Hebrew for speaking to him is actually reflexive. He overhears God's voice speaking to itself. And I think sometimes we have moments of privilege where one feels, can't prove it, it's a very private experience, I'm party to overhearing the infinite life speaking to itself. And that's what engenders awe, actually.
Yeah.
I've never ever, I mean, obviously, because I'm not reading Jewish literature and I'm not reading those lines in the Hebrew, but that's so beautiful. That's such a beautiful distinction. That's such a beautiful way of framing that in and through creation we can hear God speaking to himself through it. That really, I don't know, that's left me in awe, really, because that really, really touches upon the sacredness of the earth that he made and fashioned, and that's so beautiful. The other, again, just going back to just some of the research that I'm very geekily immersed in, Daka Kaltner, who I mentioned earlier, speaking of awe, he says that most people will experience what they believe to be a sense of awe, but it's such an elusive emotion that it's quite hard to pin down, when they see an act of what he called moral beauty. So humans just being excellent humans towards the natural world, towards other humans, towards animals, all of these things. And that's another thing that your book is so lovely in that it really paints this beautiful picture of what humans were designed to be and makes you want to get there, even with all the brokenness that we are and all the breaking thingsness within us. Is there that? Can you speak to us a little bit about moral beauty and how just humans being good to each other is also something that was designed to awe us as well?
It's interesting to hear you say that, because just this morning I was writing very early about a scene. I was writing about gratitude, and I was recalling a scene from a hospice many years, I couldn't even tell you how long, maybe 25 years ago, where I was called to a room with a couple. I hadn't met them before, but there was a request, would a chaplain please come and pray with them, because the young man was very near to death. And I go to this room and I have no idea what I'm going to say. And I kind of sit down there, and this lovely couple, and he turns towards me and he just says, do you have a prayer about the beauty of life? Because we've loved our life together. And I muttered something from a psalm, but he stopped me after a few words and just took over, and he said, look, he was holding his wife's hand, I think, and just saying, we've loved our walks in the mountains and also city walking, just through the small streets and the churchyards and the different parts of London. We've loved that too, haven't we? And they just talked to each other. I was overhearing for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And then he turned to me and he said, just very simply, and now say a prayer for the end of life because it's over. And makes me shiver to think of it. There was such graciousness in it and such generosity. And there was we didn't have. We only had 3 years. There was none of that. I mean, maybe that came later because we go back and forth in our feeling. But there was such a beauty and such a humility and generosity towards life. That moves me with awe. And actually, it's quite often in settings where people are caring deeply for somebody who's vulnerable. That, for me, that's when I've sensed the grace and presence of the sacred that human beings can bring.
It is phenomenal. I suppose we also inevitably people encounter or are brought face to face with the reality of God, arguably, in the things that look horrible as well, the scars. You yourself have relatives who suffered through the evils of Nazi Germany. I suppose, can we hear God even in that, as well as seeing this moral beauty that shines through? Is there a sense in which God can speak through even the evil?
Yeah, yes, definitely. You make me think of another of my teachers, Rabbi Hugo Grin, who was a very well-known voice on Radio 4 and on the British media and much loved. And aged 15, he was taken with his father, mother, and brother to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he survived, his brother did not. His mother survived. His father died immediately after, as many people did, immediately after the liberation. And he said, I want you to know that, I found God in Auschwitz, not the God of my childhood, the omnipotent God who controls everything, but that God was there, but disfigured and blasphemed. And that phrase, disfigured and blasphemed. So one sees the sacred somehow being so utterly destroyed, and it's horrendous. But it's a very painful being made aware of what the presence of God should be and what we've done with it. And this, of course, applies to contemporary horrors as well.
Yeah.
I suppose when you give that image, very striking image of the sacred being disfigured and blasphemed, as a Christian, it naturally invokes the image of Christ on the cross for me.
Yes.
Which is exactly that, the claim that God himself is being disfigured and blasphemed on behalf of his creation. I mean, I know that you've been very active in interfaith dialogue when it comes to Jewish and Christian theologians and leaders and so on. I'd just be fascinated to know how you approach that. Obviously, the book itself deals specifically with the Torah, but does any of kind of your thinking, has it been influenced, if you like, by, the Christian sort of, as it were, way in which Christians understand and interact with the Torah and the Old Testament in general?
Yes. Just the wish to express myself in a manner that wouldn't be alienating to people of another faith. And a wonderful editor who went through it and said, observe a practicing Christian who said, this isn't quite clear, you need to make this clear. She was super helpful. And that was essential. But wishing to make this open so that one could find oneself in it without having to be Jewish. And they're passages from other faiths where I've been able to find myself and take spiritually from something that was not in the idiom of my own tradition. And I think we have to We have to be aware of the modes of expression of different cultures, different paths, if you like, up the sacred mountain, and respect them, not sort of take them as absolute barriers, but understand this represents that within this faith. I might see it differently, but let me try and understand how it enables the spirituality for this community, for example.
It does seem like, as a culture, I could be wrong, or maybe I'm being a bit naive or optimistic, but the grey areas, the questions, mystery, really, it feels like we're becoming a tiny bit more comfortable with it, or at least wanting to be more comfortable with it. And I'm thinking, about the work of Ian McGilchrist in this, when he talks about right and left hemispheres of the brain, and how the left knows very little but thinks it knows everything. The right is more aware that it knows very little, and we need to kind of be more attuned to that right side of our brain. I've really oversimplified. A great man, a great work there, but you know what I mean. And you make very clear in your book that to believe in God, mystery is part of the deal. It's just part of the deal. And I think for anyone for whom they want to be more comfortable with mystery, they want to be more comfortable with grey areas, they want to be more comfortable with not putting solid lines around things, but we speak about disenchantment a lot. Their disenchanted brain is really hindering them. That left side of their brain is really hindering them. How are you and the tradition from which you draw so comfortable with mystery? Like, how do we get there?
It's hard to answer on the part of my whole tradition, but I think the unknowable nature of God is there from very, very early on. I mean, Maimonides, all you can say about God is the via negativa. You can say what God isn't, but what God is, God's essence, is beyond human language. And any attempt in human language is limited by the very fact that it is human language. So in the end, I don't think I put this in full in the opening part of the book, but a Kabbalistic, a mystical understanding of the first verse of Genesis, in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth, reads it very, very differently. It reads it as, in the beginning, the subject, which is not named, the unknowable, made God.
Okay.
Now, I think what that's saying, or that's my interpretation, is God is just a word. It's our limited human concept expressed in 3 letters of the alphabet, pinning a name to the infinite. But beyond that is that infinite, the unknowable, the unnameable. And God's name has always been a mystery in Judaism. The nearest perhaps one gets is at the burning bush, God's response to Moses, I am that I am, or I shall be that I shall be, the sense of a verb that is becoming, but cannot be defined and grasped. So that sense of mystery is really there.
Yes. And we often try to sort of pin that down, don't we? Because we are quite left-brained very often, and we want to sort of explain that. But it often is just left as that burning bush moment in scripture is this classic example of intense mystery, and yet somehow it speaks more by not being sort of completely understood and investigated and everything else. I mean, again, this was one of the fascinating things that's come through in lots of parts of your book, but the way in which you do engage with and draw out the ways in which Jewish thinkers down the centuries have thought about and sort of interpreted various stories that we might be quite familiar with from the Old Testament in ways that bring a fresh light to them. I'm particularly thinking of the way you talk about the Noah story. And, if you were to ask a typical secular Westerner, maybe of the Richard Dawkins variety, what they think, they would give you this is just terrible Old Testament God being vindictive and merciless towards innocent human beings. But the way that you describe the story, it suddenly brought it, to me at least, in a fresh new light, because you, as well as telling the story as it stands in the Torah, you talk about the way the Midrash tradition has sort of also tried to think about the character of Noah, and even sort of given us sort of conversations that he had in the sort of 120 years he was building this ark with the people who, this judgment was coming down upon. Do you want to just describe some of that for
Well,
those
you
who
could
are maybe
understand in that
completely
conversation
unfamiliar?
Antonio Guterres trying to tell the United Nations of the world that climate catastrophe is coming unless you take more political action. And that's the Noah of the Talmud, of rabbinic thought, saying, listen, my generation, trouble is coming. They say, oh, no, we've got the technology to deal with it. Flood, says Noah, a terrific flood. Oh, well, we've got umbrella-like structures. We'll shut the heavens off if the water comes from above. And if it comes from below, we'll plate the earth. This sense reliance on technology, on, we can deal with anything, and the lack of humility, and Noah trying to promulgate something that is coming, that he knows is coming, and he can't convince his contemporaries. There's something very, very real about that. And, it's not what I wrote in the book, but imagine, look at the flood of Valencia as an example, the horrible floods that are growing around the world. Would we really do a Noah and say, we are going to be flooded here? Are we really going to try and save every single species? Leave none of them out? Because we have this stewardship responsibility to do so. Would we do it or not? So I think there's that constant potential within that story. A classic commentary by Aviva Zornberg, whose work on the studies on the books of the Bible is really very, very significant. She not in the rabbinic account, but the biblical account, notes Noah's silence. Noah does. Why doesn't Noah argue? God, you can't do this. You can't destroy all these people. This is not right. He just does as told. And there comes from that a different strand, a critique of people who only do what they're told, without saying why and must it be thus.
It is fascinating just to see the way those different strands of Jewish thinking have sort of engaged that story. And I suppose for me, that's often it's about, I suppose, being willing to, engage with the text in a slightly different way, not a very sort of wooden literalistic way necessarily, but sort of to say, well, what's behind this? What's God saying through the text and through the sort of the stories there? And yeah, I've personally found that a remarkable example of where it does suddenly become very relevant to, climate crisis and that kind of thing in today's world. I mean, what do you do though with the people who today who do say, well, look, technology is the answer. We've been given the tools. The Elon Musks who want to say, well, we'll think our way out of this, basically, because I think that strand of humanity is growing. There's a sort of this idea that technology can and ultimately will save us, and we don't ultimately need to return to, I don't know, the idea of a God who sort of we need to listen to in the end. What's your feeling on where we're going with all of that?
So, I mean, I think there's an understanding among environmentalists that technology does have to have a part in this. It is not irrelevant, and that removing carbon from the atmosphere and the capacities to do that through the world of nature, possibly also through the world of technology, they're not irrelevant. And also the advances, for instance, in energy reduction, the removal from fossil fuels to renewables, they all depend on technological innovation. So it has a place, and one finds this again and again within spiritual environmental thinking, it also requires a change of our consciousness. So you asked, you were speaking about that before, a greater humility, a sense of re-enchantment, a sense of wonder, but also the relinquishment of the sense that we control nature, an understanding that we are coexistent. The way I came across the word, a sympoesis, a shared making with the process of nature. And that is a paradigm shift in our attitude, in the very essence of our civilization. And that's a spiritual and a moral and also an economic challenge as well.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that I do think we want that and we crave that, and I think we know that that's what we need as well. Like I write a lot of stuff, usually about Taylor Swift, but it always comes back to this. It always comes back to the same point, I think, which is that I'm getting less and less convinced that we want to be the most powerful thing there is. I'm getting less and less convinced that we want to be at the top of this fake pyramid that we've built and then put ourselves on the top of it. I actually don't think we really want to be there. And I think, we've spoken so much about awe and wonder, and I think those emotions remind us of that, because there's a deep joy in David when he says, it's not a resigned way that he says, what is man that you are mindful of them? It's full of, or at least the way I read it, is full of joy and awe. I think we want to be reminded that there is a good kind of small, and we are it. So I think you're so right in that, and Paul Kingsnorth has spoken about this a little bit, like what we think of as a political issue or a cultural issue, actually, like, it's a theological issue, it's a soul level issue, and it's like this deep spiritual disconnection. And I think you've put language to that in such a helpful way.
I appreciate what you say. I think sometimes we're feeling, I'm in this place, but I don't know how to get out of it.
Yeah.
So I was part of a very small sort of fairly silent protest about some sort of investment in oil pipeline. There were very few of us there. And we were standing in the middle of a Quaker-led silent meditation with our big banner when a gentleman walked past and shouted at us, hypocrites, all of you, you hypocrites, look at what you're wearing, it's dependent on oils, look at your placard, it's plastic, and so on, and walked off. And I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, we're not hypocrites because we mean what we say and we believe what we say, but we are implicated.
Yeah.
And I feel implicated in all kinds of ways in something which in principle I don't think is right. I don't manage to shop my food without plastic or without being unseasonable. I make efforts that way, but they're partial efforts. I'm not convinced that our recycling process creates a circular economy. Stuff gets dumped.
Yeah.
The way we travel, and how do I get out of this being implicated? Or how do all of us who feel implicated move things in a direction that frees us from this subservience to things which are wrong and also profoundly unjust? Because we've talked about enchantment, but there's also the issue of climate justice.
Yes.
And what the way of living of one part of the world does to the way of life in another part of the world.
I suppose the danger always in all of this, isn't it, is that a lot of people probably feel that same tension that you do of being implicated and feeling like, but our efforts are so compromised in the end, but that sense that we should be doing more and so on. But I suppose I think there is this danger, and we hear about this term eco-anxiety, especially among young people, where we feel overwhelmed and the kind of sense of, but what difference can I make? And we seem to be unable to solve the basic problem of human greed and corruption and the way we exploit nature. So I hear you when you say this is a spiritual issue at its core, that technology kind of, in the end, it's what our values are that will drive what we do with technology and so on. How and so you've written a book that is about sort of putting people back in connection with this ancient wisdom found in the Torah. But if someone isn't an observant Jew or even a Christian necessarily, how are you saying they can find some kind of a solution to that nagging sense of I live in a world where I feel unable to do the things that need to be done to bring it back into a kind of right relationship? What can they draw, as it were, from Torah?
There are many things, but I just want to wind back to an earlier part of what you just said. There's a much quoted saying, dates really from the late 1st century, to Rabbi Tarfon, one of the rabbis of that rabbinic compendium, the Mishnah. And he says, it's not up to you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So difficult as a task is, our obligation is to engage to the best of our capacity, and we can't see the end of it, and we don't know where it's going, and we're not empowered, and part of the world seems to be going in the opposite direction. If one look at the kind of leaders chosen or allowed to be in power, some of that feels like the opposite direction from where we need to be going. But I think people draw resources from many different places, and I'm sure your research for what you're writing takes you there. Paganism, which has a sense of a wonder within the natural world, sense of social justice, connection and awareness of communities and what the impact. I mean, the slave trade is formally supposed to be over long ago, but we don't take people from different countries. We do take their natural resources. And are we paying for them? And what is it doing? So sense of social justice, economic justice, a sense of being parts of communities that want to challenge some of the given norms of society, because there's an understanding that we need to be somewhere better. And that better is a spiritual place and a moral place and a social place, and not just an economic place. So I think there are many, many motivators happening around us.
I want to bind two questions together just to wrap up, if that's okay. Because one of them I want to borrow from a question that I think one of your congregants put to you, that you mentioned in the introduction, because you say that that book in many ways is built out of the bricks of those questions of people actually in your community and in your lived experience. And so someone says to you, how can I remain sensitive to the fragile wonder of creation? And I love the fragile wonder. That's such a poignant oxymoron there, and so true. But it's that weird sensitivity that really pulled at me. How can we remain sensitive to it? Because I think that might be the answer to so much. And then also pulling into that, what you said very, very briefly earlier, which is that the title very specifically is Listening for God, not to God. And you sort of mentioned very quickly that that's not about trying to coerce anything. Is that also about sensitivity? Is
Yes.
the difference between to and for also a sensitivity issue?
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't ask me the question that I raised very early in the book.
I
The person who said to me, who made God?
I wouldn't do that to you.
Because I have no better answer now than I had then. But I think how we inculcate a sense of mystery is itself a mystery. Enabling people to be exposed to the world of nature. I mean, very, very interestingly, I was at Dundregan, which is the centre of Trees for Life, rewilding project in Scotland. And one of the people I met there said, actually, I work for the National Health Service as a therapist, spent some of my time here because post-COVID, the number of young people with mental health challenges, some of it is not about one-to-one therapy. It's actually reconnection with the earth, so that a few days can help recenter people very profoundly. And I've heard that, in Israel, a lot of the post-trauma work has been with the Society for Protection of Nature. Okay. Trails, space, green. So enabling us to be exposed to the places where we can catch a sense of wonder. We can't make people have it, but we can. I think that's why I took the children into the forest. We can be enablers in the hope that we catch it in some manner. And why I wouldn't have gone with listening to God, because it suggests, attune yourself properly and it's all there. And I think it's much more fragmentary for most of us than that. We have moments where we feel connected to a sense of mystery, moments when we lose our self-consciousness because awe fills us as part of something much greater, and then we lose them again. They don't stay with us for the duration, but what we do know is we know that they're there, and that they came upon me once, so maybe they'll come upon me again. And I think we need to give ourselves the opportunity to have those moments, and some of it may be through formal religious practice, or for many people also, we haven't talked about music. It's extremely important.
Yes.
The world of nature important. Sometimes it's human companionship.
Just as we begin to finish, we happen to be recording this on a Friday, and at the point where the sun goes down, that will be the beginning of Sabbath for you. I often feel that that's one of the great gifts of the Jewish tradition, which has often been forgotten, especially in Christian circles. This idea of just rest, that on the seventh day God rested, and that this is a sort of something that's built in almost to the reality of how things. What I just wonder whether a kind of being able to offer that more generally to people would help them to have that moment of being able to just sit in nature, listen to music, because we live in such a incredibly frantic, hurried society, and where we just simply seem to exclude the possibility of listening for God because we're constantly listening to other things and to ourselves.
And they distract us.
Yeah.
It's a line from T.S. Eliot, distracted by distraction from distraction, which is a very poignant line. One of the great things about traditional Sabbath observance, you have to switch off all screens. Yeah. And that is a tremendous relief. And I sometimes feel when the Sabbath ends and I know I'm going to have to put my phone on and see, have I had any urgent messages? I kind of always dread that moment. So the ability to let go is really important and live in a different dimension.
Wow. Well, it's been such a delight to talk to you.
Well, it's such a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much.
I've had so much fun.
Lots of potential material there for the book you're working on as well,
I've
Belle.
soaked it up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for blessing us with so much wisdom from the Torah and the tradition around the Torah. If folk want to get hold of the book, Listening for God in Torah and Creation is the name. You can find links to it from today's show.
Indeed you can. And we want to thank you for joining us. We hope that you have loved this conversation as much as we have. If you could like, subscribe, review, rate, do all of those helpful things. And also, as ever, we are so grateful for your generosity in making this conversation and all of our other ones happen. You can be a part of it with us at seenandunseen.com/give. But for now, we will see you next time.
See you then.